Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session. Just to let you know that we're recording today's session, so hope you're all okay with that. While we are letting in our participants and audience, do you want to leave a line just introducing yourselves, telling us about your interest in being here, your interest in this area of work? Lima, should I kick off? Are we good to go? Hi, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this panel on philanthropy and local governance in the Asia-Pacific region. I see some familiar faces here, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the session is hosted by the Local Public Sector Alliance. The LPSA is a global professional network dedicated to promoting inclusive and effective local governance, decentralization, and multi-level governance. We're essentially an open knowledge-sharing hub, community of practice, and we maintain decentralization.net as our open knowledge resource. I'm Madhvi Rajadheksha, and I'm a governance and social impact practitioner from India. I co-chair the Asia Expert Working Group along with my colleagues here. We have Rachna Shrestha, who's still to join us, who is a public management specialist with the Asian Development Bank. And we have Peter Yates, who's the Regional Governance Director with the Asia Foundation. I want to start with a note of thanks to all of you for taking the time out from your very busy schedules to join us for this very critical subject. I think it's been a very difficult time for all of us in the Asia-Pacific region. We witnessed the Gen Z protests and violence and the change of government in Nepal recently. Last month, we had a similar public outrage in Indonesia, where we saw a lot of youngsters come out on the streets after a housing allowance hike to parliamentarians. We've seen a spate of natural calamities across the region. We had typhoons hit parts of the Philippines, China, Taiwan, just yesterday, Vietnam. We've had floods and landslides in parts of India. As development practitioners, we're also working in the wider context, and some of us were discussing this just before we joined on, in the context of shrinking global aid and a lot of development funding now being diverted towards defense and national priorities. So we've tried to bring together a very diverse panel today to really think and reflect on the role of philanthropy in this changing context in the region. Given that our audience is a mix of practitioners, researchers, academics, donors, our objective is really to unpack the role of Asian philanthropy and what does that really mean for local development, governance, and the communities that we work with. We've tried to bring together three different and diverse lenses. We have Farah Sofa here, who is a program officer with the Ford Foundation Indonesia. Farah works through rights-based approaches, governance approaches, wears a climate philanthropy hat. We have Anuj Bhagwati, who is a co-founder of the ATE Chandra Foundation from India. And he's been telling us about how he wears multiple hats, but he's here to tell us about his work in the urban governance space. And we have Raman Sidhu, the CEO of the Octava Foundation from Singapore, who's going to tell us a little bit about venture philanthropy and how philanthropy itself is evolving as a practice. So we have about 90 minutes today. We're going to go through each of the speakers. They're going to give us a broad overview in 10 minutes or so. We'll then have a bit of a moderated discussion for another 10, 15 minutes. And we'll then open it up for all of you to interact directly with our panelists. So I'll start with Farah, who has a bit of a presentation for us and was very kindly offered to set a context of why philanthropy matters today in this changing context. Over to you, Farah.
Thank you, Madhvi. Hi, everyone. My name is Farah Sofa. I'm with the Ford Foundation Indonesia office for 5 years now. But before, I used to work for Department for International Development as a governance advisor for Indonesia office. So my presentation today will be really short, really, because I will just talking about philanthropy role in deepening decentralization and governance. And the context is that I've observed in the last 3 years or so, philanthropy in Asia is moving beyond traditional charity to a more strategic and system-focused approach that aim at driving long-term development outcomes in governance reform and community empowerment by partnering with other philanthropy or other actors as well. It bridges citizen needs with systemic change and acting as one catalyst. Second, fostering cross-sector partnership and also supporting grassroots initiative. And in the context of Indonesia, as an US-based philanthropy, we are actually has to have an MOU with our government in doing our activities. So all of this comes as sometimes like a tricky in trying to develop all of this function, while on the other hand, now in Indonesia, for example, there's like a severe budget cut in the government, and suddenly all doors are open to us to engage with our government counterpart, which is really like changing the situation. So the next thing that I would like to talk is like what is the strategic engagement in the governance reform? So I see that Asian philanthropists particularly and also foundation, they're working very closely, if not side by side with the government, and to influence policy and improving public services. And most especially in the Southeast Asia, most of the philanthropy working on the education, health, and now emerging in the environmental protection and climate change. And philanthropy act as a thing and fun and do thanks because we have our flexible fund to support pilot project, test new ideas. So in most of the cases, it's kind of like a regulatory sandbag if the government would like to introduce like a new initiatives, right? And or we're sometimes partnering with private sectors because they could not risk to lose like certain amount of money without like a certainty of returns, right? So I see that especially in the region where I operate, it's pretty much the alliance or the collaboration with the government and private sectors. And this is some of the areas that is more detailed, which is first is on supporting policy and institution, um, where we could fund research and provide technical expertise, and especially, for example, work with local government to strengthen state capacity. In my case, because for Indonesia, working on natural resources, on, for example, monitoring the forest loss or introducing a new social forestry policy, and creating enabling policy framework for better forest management. And then with catalytic role that we play with mostly private sector, but also government, we provide the initial funding and support to get project off the ground. And if this is proven to be successful, this project could be scaled up and adopted by government or private sector, and replicated in kind of like a widespread manners that hopefully could provide systemic changes. And we could also often play a role in kind of like a convening in building the trust and relationship between different actors. And in Indonesia case, for example, it's not like civil society, government, or private sector. Even sometimes we play like a convening role for, let's say, forest policy, which not only include the Ministry of Forestry, but sometimes it needs like Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Economic Development also involved in the discussion. And in terms of the kind of like the empowering communities and bridging needs with at the grassroots level, we could provide like support on grassroots convening and also mobilization. And this is particularly true if it's on the cultural and religious groups. So we work a lot with faith-based organization in Indonesia. We are the largest Muslim country, so we work a lot with the Muslim organization, but also interfaith, yeah, with Catholic, with Hindu, and we also work with our 300 tribes, indigenous peoples, for this purpose. We also realize that for the long term, we would like to see that the not-for-profit sector or non-state actor is thriving. So we also invest in the capacity building activities in community, but also with the civil society organizations. And the other thing that we often do is also like investing in data and technological platform. So recently we work with a technological platform that providing like on-time monitoring for the restoration project. And this technological platform then working with the Uber or Grab, right? The ride-hailing services in Indonesia, Gojek, where if you go on a ride, they will charge you additional small amount of money extra for the tree plantations. And then it attracts so many like potential funders because the banks, the retail, because they need to do their like tree planting activities at least once a year. So they are happily coming into this platform, and then they work with different NGOs that then kind of like a channeling the fund from the private sector CSR budget into the on the ground tree planting activities, which is quite exciting. And the government also happy because before the government give a lot of like a forestry license to the community, but then once they get the license, they're quite stuck because they cannot translate it into like a viable economic activities. So this is one of the areas that philanthropy could play a role as well. And of course, direct support to not-for-profits. But even on this, there is this trend now that the philanthropy was encouraged to do more kind of like a general support and long-term kind of like a partnership rather than one-off or short-term project, because come back to what I said about the capacity building, I think it will make a lot of sense if the direct support to the not-for-profit sector was given in a kind of like a longer term, unrestricted manners. So then they can be thriving and becoming a better partners for the government and private sectors. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Farah, for giving us an understanding of different approaches, different philanthropic approaches through the lens of forest governance, from convening partnerships to grassroots mobilization, to capacity strengthening, to strategic support over direct support, and really building that partnership approach. We'll pick up on some of these threads as we move into the discussion. Anuj, could I turn to you to tell us about what motivated you to work on urban governance, and why does philanthropy really matter in this particular space?
I'm really happy to be here and part of this panel. Thank you all for inviting me to LPSA for doing the work that it does, and to all of you for listening. If I look at my journey towards the urban governance area, I think it comes from a simple fact that I grew up in Mumbai. I spent 6.5 years studying in a small town in the United States, and I came back after that to India. And though I'd visited many times in the 6.5 years that I was away, I'd been living in a different place. I was just a visitor then in India. And so the gaps that we had in our city of Bombay, Mumbai, were really apparent. And I come from a family background, a business background that has always worked on the social sector and on problems that there are around us as much as we've worked on the business. And so somehow it was natural for me to start getting engaged with improvements in the city, or trying to figure out how one could make living in Mumbai that much easier than it was. And a couple of things happened. Some friends of mine had started an organization called the Association of Youth for a Better India. And so I started attending some of their meetings, and a couple of us got interested in starting something called the Praja Foundation. And the idea of Praja was quite simple. It was to educate people in what they should expect in terms of service levels from the government, and then to simply make it more easy for people to connect with the government and the service providers, to improve communication, and thereby try to give feedback to improve services. As we went along, of course, Praja evolved. We did surveys to help the government figure out what people wanted in a more structured way. We created an online complaint management system. We started doing white papers based on data that was publicly available on various subjects of interest to citizens, and started then trying to figure out the way in which cities were managed. And another thing that happened at the time was that I had a chance encounter with an architect and urban planner called Rahul Mehrotra, who, when I told him about Praja and what we were doing, said, well, we have a complementary effort going on, the Urban Design Research Institute. So why don't you start coming to our meetings and seeing what we're doing? And as time went on, I got drawn into what the Urban Design Research Institute was trying to do, which was to use urban planning, urban design, and revitalize the city of Mumbai. Of course, as UDRI, the Urban Design Research Institute is often abbreviated to UDRI because that's less of a mouthful. As the UDRI went along, that also has evolved and done different things. So my engagement actually in the beginning was more as a field worker, you could say, in this space. And as I understood better what needed to be done, sometimes I felt that if I could do something like this and prove a point, that here's a way that we can do things that's different, that's better than what we're doing right now, it might convince people, the government, citizens, whoever the stakeholders are, that it's worthwhile to do. But you need to commit some resources in order to get the ball moving, so to speak. And so that's how we started getting involved from ATE's side. And then once we set up the foundation with the Chandra family as the AT Chandra Foundation, and also supporting some of the efforts that we help get off the ground. I think that philanthropy is very important when it comes to many issues concerning governance, because there is a system and that system works at some level. So that means that to change it sometimes is not that easy. And to be able to use philanthropic capital to make little experiments, explorations, put forward ideas, to speculate sometimes about what might be or what could be, it's very important to have unbiased, in some sense, and patient capital. Uh, Cities are like ecosystems in that they consist of many interconnected and interacting systems and subsystems. So they're quite complicated. It's not something that is easy to do experiments in. A city is not something that's easy to experiment in sometimes, and to reduce the risk for the people in government, for individuals, I think is a very useful aspect. Also, sometimes if you believe in something and you can convince people about what you believe in, then philanthropy can be quite patient. And that's what you need if you want to do experiments that lead towards systemic change. And this is why I feel that philanthropy is really important, because what you want to try to do sometimes in cities, because of the sheer scale, is to do experiments at system level, because if they stick then at system level, then you can begin to address the scale that you need to make a dent at city level. And this operating system kind of approach that you need to take is something that I think patient philanthropy with understanding, with research backing it, is well suited for. So that's really my story and what I've been doing. If you look at the kinds of projects that we've done, then it gives you an example perhaps of what others might want to do or not do if they want to learn from our mistakes. We think that creating benchmarks and transparency is something that's important to introduce new systems or to make trials. That's also something that's quite important. So, for example, we tried to put together in Praja the Urban Governance Index, looking at decentralization in India. At the Urban Design Research Institute, we put together the Spatial Planning Index, trying to look at different practices in spatial planning across India. We looked at about 25 cities. And so the idea is that you do this research so that cities can put into action the best practices that they see in a very relevant, comparable group, other cities in the country. So this way, the experimentation is done somewhere else, but you might not know about it, but you get. Sorry, I somehow waved my hands and muted myself. But I think it was only for a second. So we've always tried to build institutional capacity, because we think that if we can do that, then again you can address issues at scale. And we've also worked in the area of rural governance, because when we've done rejuvenation of water bodies in the rural areas, which is very important to address issues of water security, we found that the model that works is when you have a community group, the local government, the Gram Panchayat, the state officials in the block or the sub region of the state, as well as others in the state, all engaged. And when you get everyone involved and get them aligned towards a goal, and you provide the tools, then you find that there is a constituency that gets together that you also hope can address other problems besides the one that you're working on. I talked briefly about the online complaint management system. That was the first thing, one of the first things that Praja did. But in general, that's a big area for us, because we think that this feedback mechanism, especially when you're looking at system change, is critical, and citizen engagement is what provides you with the feedback that you need to serve better the citizens and the entire group of people that you're working together with. And finally, I just want to say one thing, that if you look at the statement or the phrase urban governance, then people see this as saying that you're trying to correct misgovernance somewhere. But I don't think that's really what we're trying to do. We're not trying to say anybody's misgoverning or anything like that. What we're trying to say is that the city, the world, in fact, is a shared space. And if we have better ways of working together, then we'll all be better off. Every person in the government is also a citizen, and every citizen wants to work with their government, because we are the ones in many cases that have elected our government. And so it's really about cooperation and finding better ways to work together that we do this work. So that's what I had prepared, Madhvi, mentally, to say to everybody, and I'd like to pass it back to you. If you want me to address something else specifically, of course, I'm happy to do so.
Thanks, Anuj. Thank you for sharing your personal journey. Interesting for people to understand how you move from, say, your activist days to your philanthropy days, but also to unpack a bit about how systems level experiments in patient capital then can really lead to change in these shared spaces that we're talking about. I think the concept of shared spaces, partnerships is forefront in this at the forefront in this discussion as well. We'll move to Raman and come back to you, Anuj. Raman, we wanted to move into the space of venture philanthropy, often seen as a new innovative mechanism within the philanthropic space. So if you could tell us your experience from Singapore, maybe start with the basics of what is venture philanthropy for those who are not familiar with the term. And what is the kind of impact that you're hoping to achieve? I know you'll have worked in the equitable education space, so looking at a traditional service delivery model in a very different way. So over to you, please.
Fabulous. Thank you so very much for the invite. This is an absolute opportunity to be speaking, and a privilege to be speaking alongside Anuj, who, the work of the A.T. Chandra Foundation that I've admired for years. And I was thinking, as I come into the conversation, I was thinking of the participants and what is probably an alternative view that Anuj and Farah might have already offered. So I intentionally listened into their insight. So maybe I'd cover it in two places. One is venture philanthropy as an approach, with a caveat that please see it as a jargon and everybody applies it differently. But it's probably a shorthand for private equity foundation principles or private equity investing principles, and applying it in a broader impact generation space, right? And then the second construct I was thinking was maybe also offering a view where in Southeast Asia we're a Singapore-based foundation, a grant maker. And when we work in the region, it puts us into an international funder space. And what is the role of an international funder, and how do we approach it in the construct of decentralization, local governance, and whose role is it when it's an international funder engaging in what matters locally, and how far do we as a foundation out of Singapore consider where our boundaries are and where our fair play is and where it isn't. So maybe that's a perspective I could add to the conversation. So if that's okay, then happy to introduce myself. I am Raman Sidhu, been in the philanthropy sector across UK and Singapore for about 14 plus years now. Most of my work has been around education and equity. I started my career when venture philanthropy was really early days, and there were 3 organizations in the world at that point in time. one in UK, one in the US, and one up in Scotland in the UK as well as Inspiring Scotland. And I was working in one of those three. So we had a lot of sharing, and I used to work for an organization called Impetus, the private equity foundation, which is now only called Impetus. Which is what led to the whole venture philanthropy movement, because the founder, board member of Impetus then came in and set up AVPN, EVPA, and then the African venture philanthropy, the gentleman Doug Miller. So a lot of my prior work to coming to this philanthropy space and venture philanthropy in specific, I was a management consultant and a banker prior to that. So a bit of a refugee into the sector. But that was the toolkit I was coming in, and that toolkit of business consulting spoke mostly to this venture philanthropy capacity building space. So I also wanted to kind of maybe call out that there is a school of thought in venture philanthropy, which I felt more aligned to. But at the same time, because I've been in this venture philanthropy space for the 15 years, I must admit that there were concepts that I came in with, and I had to eat a lot of humble pie when applying them on the impact creation space. And just to call out some of those, right? The first is we are a sector that is called what we are not. We are a not-for-profit, right? We're not even known for what we are. We are called for what we are not. And I think there is an underlying challenge to that, because we innately, as economies, think of it a lesser good, a useful good, but a lesser good, that even it's defined for what it isn't, because it's defined against a benchmark of what good is, which is for profit. Right? And not for profit. So, and in that there are challenges, because the challenge is the service that we end up resourcing or piloting or providing are usually services that somebody else is responsible for providing. Right? More than most of the times, those services or those provisions are expected of effective government. And in places where effective governance isn't there, then there is room for all hands to be joined to do as much as we can, right? So that's one challenge, that we are providing services and creating services in the space where we may not be the legitimate owners of the problem or of the solutions. That's one construct. And the second construct is we are providing services to those who don't pay for these services. So they are the client, but not the paying one. But who pays for the provision is somebody else with a gracious heart, which is the philanthropist or the institutional funders, the trusts, the foundations of this world, right? And that's where the challenge of understanding how do you deploy these resources and what is the role that resources should play. So at Octava, we think of it, we're a young foundation. We are 8 years in the making, nowhere close to Ford Foundation or Anuj's work. And we've had an evolved model, right? We started our work 8 years ago as an individual donor who wanted to look at education and think of equity in education, because he benefited from a great education opportunities. And we were really at that point in time saying, well, let the organization who know best tell us what resource they need, and let's just give them the resource for them to go ahead and deploy the resource as they will. Very quickly, we realized that we didn't have a lot of data come back on what change was getting created, or sometimes our horizons were too short to even see the change. And then we were seeking something from organizations that they potentially couldn't produce in that timeline. And organizations and partners were committing to us the level of impact that they themselves didn't know or had a clear view of was probable in their theory of change. So there was a real tension in that initial stage where we were doing a lot of learning of how change happens and what are the kind of capacity gaps. And I'm speaking specifically in Singapore for education. And that led to our second phase of work where we realized that we can't be kind of spraying and praying all across the education system and expect change to happen. We became a bit more intentional to what Farah was mentioning, more strategic in which issue do we really care about and what part of that issue we can give it a genuine attempt to solve. So we've kind of made our problem statement a bit more specific. So at this point in time in Singapore, we work in the space of disadvantage gap in education. And while Singapore is an education system which is par excellence to anything else that you could see or find, wherever there's a pecking order, there's a bottom. So even in Singapore, we have a bottom. That bottom is a slither. But we have about 15,000 families, for example, that are on state welfare system. And in those families, the young children are not equitably learning. So our problem statement is very, very specific. Our numbers are relatively small. But because it's a last mile solution in a system that works, that work is even more difficult to transpire impact in because it's the very last mile. And it's a last mile for a reason, because it is so unsolvable and it's so intrinsic and so sticky. So we work in the complexity of things, but we have scaled our ambition from education for all to very specific issues that we can solve for. So that's one layer of venture philanthropy that we do, which is we understand the problem, and then we identify which part of that problem we can solve, not just with our funding, but also with other resources that we can bring to the table. Whether it's the backbone work, whether it's funding evidence, whether it's building new evidence, whether it's building new frameworks, but also enabling capacity of the organization, technical and others. And not just kind of broadly speaking, enable them with the fund and ask for a program objectives to be met. So that's kind of where we are and what we do. Maybe then I move to how it is different when we as a Singapore funder show up. So we have a country program in Thailand, and we have a regional program that we invest in education technologies, which is broadly for the region. And we have an evolving, I would say, country program, which is a work in progress for Timor-Leste. Thailand is a very mature education system. And when we started looking at Thailand, I think the first port of call for us was just understand the system and the challenges that are, and then finding the white spaces where a small foundation like us could genuinely attempt to create some added value. So we identified those white spaces, and in those white spaces, we then started to look out for local partners, not local implementing partners first and foremost, but local funders who understand the landscape and have the legitimate right to be operating in the country that they operate in, and have a pulse on the political sentiment, the political economy of things, as well as the capacity of the local organization. So they kind of could help us chart the ways. And we started thinking about what is the additional value we could bring to local funders in doing their work in education better. So that was our starting point. We currently have a country program where maybe an interesting element for the participants today are, so Thailand has a decentralized system. There are district teams who work in education and take local decisions. At the same time, there is a broad framework that is offered at a center level of what standards are, what assessments should look like, what teacher capacity and quality looks like. So we've done a three-way work there. We have a pilot that's running, which will go into a scientific kind of a quasi-experiment evaluation. The government is paying part of the intervention cost. The local funder is curating it and implementing part of the cost and the local programming. And we are offering additional resources that between them was still a deficit to pay for the evaluation. And our hope is that if the idea works and the government having a close look, having a balcony seat on this program is able to assess and learn from, then probably there's a dotted line to adoption, and we will like to support the next phase of our work as well, which is the adoption work of how do you make the existing philanthropy funded intervention cost effective for the state to take on, because that's the other challenge we see in philanthropy funded projects. They are not created for state funding models, state capacity models, or for state to pick up and run with. So I think the last thing probably I just wanted to leave with you was, when thinking about philanthropy and what philanthropy can do, and yes, we think of risk and we think of providing risk capital, providing innovative capital. Over the years, it has daunted on me that we are probably barking the wrong horse, or the wrong tree, barking the wrong tree, when it comes to supporting pilots that are not within the system or don't have a dotted line of the sphere within the system. When we start funding programs that are building a tangent outside of the system and don't consider the local capacity, local complexities in the design, and upfront want to think about how they will themselves become redundant, I think we end up kind of doing a lot of this pilot churn rather than local capacity development. And local capacity can come from ground up initiatives, but those ground up initiatives needs to be intentional in how they're working alongside the system and not in a tangent or in a different direction. So I think that's kind of one learning I have for how to do philanthropy, is to be very, very cautious of not going down the route of funding innovation for the sake of it, but funding innovation that offers an alternative way of thinking to the system and have a dotted line into the system. Thank you, Madhvi. I think I have taken all of my 10 minutes, so back to you.
No, thanks very much, Raman. Some very, very pertinent points. Firstly, thank you for reminding us about how humbling the impact space is. As a practitioner, I think that's very relatable. But also about your journey of moving from, let's fund education as a whole sector to something more strategic. And the last point you made, I think, is something I'd like to pick up a bit more on in terms of working within systems. We have a very experienced audience here, so I'm actually going to swap around the format with Lima's permission and see if the audience has any questions, any reflections before I pose some questions to the panelists. Anybody would like to come in? Just unmute yourselves and go ahead if so. Okay, while you'll gather your thoughts, maybe I'll kick us off and we can come back to everyone. I wanted to pick up on Raman's last point of actually, ensuring that our systems our innovations and risk capital is also within the system. Anuj, you made a very similar point about institutional capacity and working at scale. And that's often been one of the critiques of governance support from the outside, that it does not strengthen the capacity of the existing system. So I just wanted to understand your approach to really strengthening institutional capacity And how do you avoid creating that dependency on you all as a philanthropic organization, which is one of the challenges NGOs face, right? You get funding year on year from people who trust you, trust your work. So how do you cut off that cord at some point?
I think that early on, one of the first things we did at Praja was to create this online complaint management system, OCMS. And we tried it, we ran it for some time, and it was handed over to the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai. And so that was a exit in some sense. And then you have to do new projects. Try to fund. You try to get funding for those new projects. So there was an exit there, and the exit was actually that it became part of the system. So in many cases, when we are looking at it as funders, we're also trying to have that in mind, because as a small foundation, you'll never be able to substitute the government for doing something for people, because forget about size, it's also about legitimacy. The people elect the government, or they have a government for a reason. So you need to think about how you can hand over to the government. And if you do some institution building, capacity building support for institutions, then you need to try to figure out how this is going to make lasting change by being really part of what their standard operating procedure is evolving to. So I think that both as a nonprofit in the sphere as well as a funder, you have to think about what's the logical exit for this. And the timeframes can be long, because a city is a very complex system. Governing cities, therefore, also is complicated. It's very hard to see impact, because there are so many actions that need to be coordinated. If you give medical care or something like that, the reward, the assessment can be immediate. But when you try to revitalize part of the city, that's work that the Urban Design Research Institute and the Kalagoda Association did. That you can see some impact, but it's still a long way to go. And it's been 30 years almost, more than 25 years of holding the Kalagoda festival here. So the time frames are long, it's rewarding. You influence, you impact a lot of people if you can make something stick. And you do need to always think about, how do I make this stick? How do I make it bigger than me? How do I make it separate from me? And how do I move on in some sense and try to find something else that I can help with?
Thanks, Anuj. And a good reminder of looking beyond oneself and one's own organization. If I could ask a bit of a provocative question, Farah, maybe to you. Since you've worn many hats, you've worn the DFID hat, moved into the philanthropic space. I've been hearing a lot of trust and a lot of partnership building in our approach. At the same time, the context in which we are working is a context of a lot of mistrust and distrust and disinformation. What we saw in Nepal, what we saw in Indonesia more recently, and what we see in a lot of other countries, even if it hasn't come to that point, is an environment of mistrust between citizens and governments. And just wondering, what is it that philanthropists need to do differently in these times towards rebuilding those bridges of trust? And also, how do you take on subjects that are more provocative? You talked about community rights, for instance, and not the right space is confrontational by design to governance sometimes. So how do you then navigate these difficult spaces and bring everyone together?
I think looking at my experience in this life and previous life has defeated Pfizer, right? I think it's very important to have like an open and honest conversation with your partners on some of the very sensitive issues. So, for example, like with the indigenous people's rights, which our government, like many other Asian government, actually refuse to recognize out of the fear that this will create like a federalism, right? So somehow, so I would say like open and honest conversation. And secondly, also kind of like starting from our common interests, which is perhaps like having a welfare for all citizens of Indonesia. And oftentimes, all of these peoples and groups are the most marginalized group within the society. So we start from there, and also I think the to communicate that in such a way that it's not a threatening for the government, but looking out for options, right? And also common interest. That is the key, I think, Murphy, in pushing this forward. And if the conversation getting difficult, like and oftentimes stuck, then it's okay. You just said like, okay, it seems like, it's not, we're not able to agree on that. Maybe tomorrow or next week we could revisit the conversation and then start over again. And that's how you are building your trust and partnership, really, because you go through and press through all of these difficult conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. So what you're saying is price open the space that is available and build that trust to work on the tougher issues to address the bigger challenges.
Yes.
Lima, you have a question for Raman, I think. So over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to the speakers. Those were a lot of thought-provoking ideas. My question is to Raman, like Madhvi mentioned, and I was thinking a lot about how do you measure all of this? Because governance itself is so complex if you are to compare against service delivery, where there are different frameworks and indicators. So when it comes to philanthropic investments in governance or in local governance, are there certain frameworks, or how do you assess that something is tangible, that your investment is worthwhile?
Thank you, Lima. That's a great question. So I'd probably not take it only from a construct of investing in local governance or decentralization, so to speak, but broadly in investing in local partners and investing in program and interventions. So we take it and I'm speaking from Octava Foundation's perspective, but I can also happily speak from an education funders perspective. At this point in time, Octava is also chairing the International Education Funders Group Steering Committee. So I'm happy to speak from that perspective as well. I think it's really important when we start thinking about solutioning that we do understand the problem that we are trying to solve very deeply, and in that, understanding and quantifying the problem. So understanding the data that is qualitative and quantitative on what are the reasons of why the problem exists and is in situ, and then thinking about what are your investment hypotheses, for example. And I'm intentionally using these words because these are the terminologies of venture philanthropy, right? We do take an investment hypothesis approach versus how does investing in a particular intervention offers to open up new ways of thinking within the system. How would it change some of the things in situ that needs to shift, but you need to provide an alternative model, and advocacy would only go thus far, right? Nudging on a particular thing only goes thus far. You have to actually show practical ways of how it can be done. And that's where we deploy our risk capital. So we think of measurement at three folds. One is understanding at the ecosystem, at the system level, what is the added value that needs to be generated to shift the problem? We quantify that upfront through our research and understanding of the landscape, and kind of put it fairly squarely on our theory of change, that at a systemic level, we like to produce, showcase specific level of knowledge, specific level of evidence, or a specific level of intervention. Then we think of it at the program level. So at an intervention level, what is the growth that particular program is seeing from the time it was invested by us, and from the time and at what point in time we are exiting? What is the effectiveness of that program? What is the efficacy of that program? And what is the growth of that program at the core level of, can it sustain the intervention cohort after cohort, engagement after engagement, right? So those are the frames. And then we also look at it at the client level. So an intervention is looking at changing learner outcomes for literacy, for example, in Tatum. There's a program that we are supporting in Timor. And Timor is really interesting because while we want to benchmark those outcomes of what does learning literacy in Tatum means, there aren't a benchmark in the system itself on what literacy level for primary 1, primary 2 across the country is. So I think as we were thinking about that intervention, we are now thinking about how do we actually work with the state to help think about benchmarks, the data infrastructure and the data benchmarks that the system needs to produce, that these interventions can actually compare themselves up against. Otherwise, I think it's very difficult for singular interventions to have the burden of making a comparable case without having a comparative data. Then you end up going down the route of RCT for everything, because you're trying to control and you want to do a treatment, and I think we need to relieve ourselves of some of those pressures of evaluation by having some investing in local data sets. So I think where possible, we compare the intervention success and its added value, or its differential value, for example, for learning outcomes. So how quickly were those outcomes able to be manifest? How deep they were, how further they could be sustained, and how do they compare to the local? So I'm just using learning outcome as one example, but I can talk to you about other education outcomes as well. But I hope that gives you like the frame of the ecosystem. So our theory of change actually has all of these three outcomes for the domain that we work in the context that we decide to work in. So it's context specific framework, not a broad Octava framework to say in Timor, we're looking at very different markers of success versus Thailand versus Singapore.
Thank you, Raman. I'm hearing a lot of what resonates with me in terms of using data meaningfully, using that not just to tick your boxes in your impact evaluations, but to think about what the root cause is, what are the outliers, and how does that speak to then driving more reform. So thanks for that. Anuj, I know you're at the hour and need to leave, but you have your hand up, something you wanted to come in with?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've found that measurement is really a challenge. So if you look at cities and you look at it, there are so many different measures of quality of life. The Economist magazine has one, and the Indian government has several. Just if you look at the few indicator sets that we've looked at, it's already overwhelming because they're looking at several hundred indicators. Some of them look like they're more process oriented, not outcome oriented. Some of them are measures of the system. So that's, for example, the Urban Governance Index of Praja looks at what the system is as to where certain decisions are made in some part. And I think that it's an area where we do need to try to focus on some set of points, the urban ecosystem in general, as to what are the outcomes we want to look at and what are the enablers that we want to look at. That would be, I think, a worthwhile thing to do. Of course, it's always a challenge to get agreement on these things. I think at the UN also, they appointed Kaushik Basu to lead a team, I think, to look into this in general. He was the former chief economic advisor in India and also the chief economist at the World Bank. And he also is one that Raman talked about not doing RCTs for everything, but I think he did write a nice paper on when you might want to choose reasoned intuition, I think he called it, as opposed to randomized control trials. But anyway, I think that measurement is important, but it's difficult, you know. And it's difficult because sometimes the subject is difficult when you're looking at a system like a city, and some measures you're taking within that. Of course, it's difficult, but it's also difficult because there's such a diversity of views and factors one needs to take into account. Anyway, sorry. Uh, Back to you, Madhvi. And I'll have to leave now, so thank you all very much. But happy to answer any questions anybody has by email at any time. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time, Manoj. And some pertinent points about measurement and which aspects of the system do you measure, and also whether decision makers really engage with the same kind of data that we're looking at when they make policy decisions. I'm going to turn to Purushottam, who's on in our audience. Purushottam, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Madhavi. My camera is not working. So I
That's
have
totally
one
all right.
questions. Only what I am trying to say that how can we get trust among the stakeholders? Our services is access to all, and that is also cost effective. Because in our country like Nepal, where three spheres of government are exist, and they have their own responsibility to deliver services throughout the territory, and philanthropic types of institutions go in very small places, but there will be some sort of differentiation among the service providers and stakeholders as well, and some sort of conflict arises. How can we solve this sort of questions in the delivery of services? That was my question.
Thank you, Purushottam. Farah, Raman, would either of you like to pick it up? The question of trust and how do we build trust in services? What strategies do we have when it comes to working with different levels of government? Purushottam mentioned Nepal, where there are 3 levels of government, for instance.
I can start and maybe Raman after that. So I think what I see our partners do in Indonesia is like have a consistent and continuous communication, Parusuttam, with all level of government. But of course, the one that you work closer is your main kind of like a stakeholder, right? And I think it's very important to have like a clear and concise message about what is it that you want to achieve. So decide it like a common objective and how you get there. Because I think looking at the characteristic of different players, right? They can have like a different ways in getting there, but as long as that agreement of what we want to achieve together, I think that is good enough. And also kind of agreed on if there is like a disagreement or concerns, how you could address it within your closest kind of like a government counterpart, but also like above or below the area where you operate, and also kind of like make it like as open and transparent as possible is very important, and kind of like having like a clear documentation on every step is needed, yeah. So then you can move forward rather than like going in a circle. I'll stop there. Thank you.
A very relevant point, Farah, where we see a lot of government officials change positions and posts, right? So
Yeah.
just maintaining that documentation, taking off
Mhm.
from, where your discussions had reached, but staying engaged, building that trust almost as a continuous process, not a one-off, not only limited to your organization or program, I think is the other point you're making. Raman, anything to add here?
I think Faraz can actually given a very good frame for Purushottam, but I don't understand Purushottam's kind of context. So I'm not sure if these things are relevant, but I'll speak it more from a broad perspective of trust building with the state, especially for a developmental organization or a grassroots organization trying to, or a non-for-profit or a social purpose organization. I think there is something to be said about intentionality of impact, the narrative of how we narrate the need for solutions and not just our solution, and the body language we take, which is that of this is a collective problem and we are showing up to solve for it, and where possible finding non-antagonizing way of engagement. So that's kind of the first frame. This is not to say, oh, there is political power and political economy in this. Of course, these are recognizable things, and not to say lower down the temperature on what you feel passionately about. But what I'm saying is, if we are in for the longer benefit of impact for the communities that we care about, then we ought to go beyond what you and I think of what the right solution is, and to really be the negotiator of change. And being a negotiator of change and being an activist is a there's probably contours of that body language that needs to be kind of honored in these engagements. So I think that's the first frame, right? So, and the second frame is, what is the role that data can play in trust building? And I think this is the complexity, right? Who are we collecting data for? And are we using data to be accountable to the purpose of why we do this work? Which, for example, is like, I want to minimize the failure or the lower attainment of Malay population in Singapore at a national exam, which is at year 6. And I want to do that and I want to measure that data for whom? I want to measure the data on my intervention success for myself, to project to others that this is a great program, or actually to make sure that we are on the trajectory that this will lower the prevalence rate of failure for Malay population in the Singapore education system. And if the answer is the latter, which is, am I meeting my purpose? That's where the golden nuggets are, where we are using the data for the intentional purpose that we had intended to start the programming for. And by the way, then do slice the data for external communication, internal communication. But that's the purpose of the data, and using data to evolve the program for the purpose. And I think that's where trust comes in, when we can genuinely and authentically show up by saying, I started with this intervention with these assumptions, but I'm evolving to this from what I'm learning, and I may evolve further. I'm actively collecting information that will inform the possibility of this intervention to be highly probable for impact. And I think that's trust building. That will induce trust at a different level. And at least from a philanthropy funder's perspective, that's the authentic story of data and purpose that we like hearing, because that's where the alignment of purpose is and the purpose of why we collect data is. And that's where the trust then comes in using data.
Thank you so much, both. Raman, you made some good points about framing the negotiation and what you want to get out of it and how do you approach that question. And then how do you build authenticity in the narrative that we are trying to pursue from whatever frame we're coming from. I wanted to maybe ask one last thought in terms of just looking ahead. You know, we looked a lot at what's happened in the recent times in the region. Looking ahead, if we were to look at the philanthropic space in the region, what are the one or two trends that you would look out for, keeping in mind, you know, civic space, keeping in mind citizen governance engagement, really building that collaborative spirit, trust that we've been talking about?
I will let Raman first, and then I'll.
Okay. Thank you, Farah. And I think wearing a funder hat, and if anybody is working in a funding organization within the audience today, I think keeping an eye on capacity before complexity. Because very quickly we start thinking about ideal complex policies but not giving sufficient heed to the capacity of delivering such. So I think as we evolve in whichever sector you are, I work in education, so I actively think about how do I think about capacity in the education system before putting complexity of systems into it and making it even more complex and even more complex. For example, decentralization is great, but it's not the be all of it, right? We have to think about capacity and policies at the central level. There has to be some directive at the central level that needs to be held by the center and then needs to be kind of followed on from the decentralization. So I think, again, the other way of looking at this capacity with complexity balance would be power versus proximity. Right, that's another kind of trade-off or something that we have to constantly hold in balance. So I would look out for these things in our designing, in what we fund, in what we enable, what we partner.
Thanks, Raman. A good reminder to keep that front and center in terms of starting from understanding capacity, starting from where we're at, rather than what is ideal notionally. So very well received. Farah, over to you.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I see is happening now emerging is that philanthropy is shifting from their conventional model into adopting a strategic and community-centered model that prioritize local relevance and system-level changes. And this means that moving from charitable giving toward more proactive and collaborative approach, like I mentioned before, with different actors that has a stake in that particular area. Yeah, and also in terms of the collaboration, it tends to be cross-border, cross issues, and bringing more interesting actors than just government, civil society, and private sectors. And so now we have like also impact investing and innovative financing, blended finance model, and what have you, right? And this is particularly, I think, suitable for the Asia landscape where things could be completely different from one place to the other. But all in all, I think there's a lot of emphasis, and I agree with Raman that we need to think about invest in people and system first, long term, not just project, and also investing in building trust and relationship. And being a philanthropy, that means you could embrace a flexible and collaborative approach better than other type of funding. I'll stop there, Madhuri. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. Good to know we're moving beyond, the fixed narratives of state to society in three-dimensional ways of private government and the civil society space to think of other actors who can engage and working towards a purpose. I wanted to thank you all for your reflections. I think it's been a very, very rich discussion, very insightful. I think it points to our rich culture of giving in the region and why we must preserve this space very carefully. What we heard from everybody was about how we can accomplish much more together than in isolation. Farah just talked about collaboration across borders, across cultures, across issues. What we're also hearing from three philanthropists in the space is that philanthropists are looking to be partners today and not just traditional funders. So they are committed to long-term change, strategic interventions, really working with trust in collaborative ways to catalyze systemic transformation. And that, I guess, impact is really paired and amplified when we work with this collective power of partnerships and innovative models. So thank you all for joining in, for contributing. And I hope this exchange was useful to all of you. We look forward to staying engaged from the LPSA and to taking forward some of these conversations and partnerships. So thank you for your time.